So hi, my name is Dan Podsedly. I work at Pivotal and have worked at Pivotal for a long time. I don't even know how long. The name of this talk is Scaling Your Product Team While Staying Agile, but I think the last two words, especially the last one, is something that's a bit of a given these days, right? Who here is not working in some sort of an agile fashion? Okay, so everything is agile. What we're talking about is scaling product teams. So really it's about scaling people, right? Everyone else in this talk is talking about scaling architectures. I'm here to talk about scaling us, human beings. So first, a couple of words on these two words, the project versus product, right? When we think of working together on software things, right? The word project is a natural one that comes to mind. The problem with that word is that it implies something very finite, right? We get together, we build something, the project is done, we move on, we work on the next project, and we have a nice long list of projects we worked on LinkedIn or our resumes. In contrast, products are things that imply something that endures, that lives forever, right? You may organize in a project, you build a product, that product is the thing that lives beyond the project, right? It has to evolve, it has to be indefinite, if it's a successful project at least, or product rather. So basically, we want to embrace a culture, a mindset of sustainability that is very much focused on the customer, because that is who the product is for. So let's talk about products. They tend to start nice and simple. They solve a problem. Hopefully they solve it well. They gain traction, market fit, all of that. And they evolve until you end up with something like this, right? Complexity, there's sort of like a natural entropy toward more complicated things in your product. This is a real thing, by the way. You can buy on Amazon. I don't know why you would, but you can. So the thing with products, right? When you're successful, you will suddenly have competition, right? You may have had a product for a long time. You're a big company. There's a startup around every corner now waiting to eat your lunch and disrupt you. Platforms evolve. If you have an iOS app, every year or so, there's a major new iOS version that forces you to do some big things, some major changes, right? Split screens, new UI layouts, etc. Every time you add more and more to your product, new complexity or new feature, you get this sort of non-linear increase in complexity because everything has to work together, right? And the more features you have, there's a combinatory explosion. And products are really like services these days, right? Your customers expect your product to evolve with them as they evolve. So, we have to build products. These products have to grow. They will get more complex. We will add people, right? That's inevitable. How do we organize so we can grow, but do so sustainably, right? So really, Agile is turning into sort of a sustainable culture thing for us. Where do I come from? My background is Pivotal Labs, right? Pivotal, that we know today. How many here, by the way, work at Pivotal or are pretty close to Pivotal? All right, so most of you know our world. Pivotal Labs started over a decade ago. We focused on building products for startups, but doing it in a very sort of, we did it with them, right? We co-developed that. Not only did we build their products and gave them the fish, we taught them how to fish. And what we did in the early days is we got integrated into certain startups that are pretty well known today, like Google and Twitter, and we were there to try and institute more of a team-based sustainable culture, right? So we've been doing this for a long time. And we've also grown. Pivotal Labs has grown from a handful of us back there in the mid-2000s to probably something like 500 people today, all over the Pivotal offices around the world. We also launched initially an internal tool, right, that helped us organize and work as teams and build products. It got popular, so we turned it into a product, and this is something I've been managing ever since the birth of this guy. We went from a handful of people working on it once in a while to around 40 people as a dedicated team today. And these days, it is the sort of transparent core, as we call it. It's the super brain. It's where all the collaboration is organized and happens on every product, every project at Pivotal these days, and lots of companies around the world. So we maybe didn't realize this until later on, but what we really were about from day one is sustainability, right? Everything we did, all of the extreme programming practices that you may have heard about, pairing, test driving, short iterations, small stories, fast feedback loops, cycling, all of that was because we knew that software would sort of outlive us, right? We wanted to build products that could evolve as the product companies or the teams, our customers, learned about what those products really had to do. Things always got complex. So all of these tools just work together to create this very sustainable culture and environment. One thing that we did is we always focused on transitioning our products to our customers smoothly, right? We taught them how to fish, and then they added more people to our team. We ramped down, and they just took it away without any disruption, right? They could just keep going forever and ever, and many of them did, right? There are companies that worked with Pivotal Labs 10 years ago that are still going. They're much bigger now. They're still doing things the same way. They're still using more or less the same tools, including Tracker. They've been successful. They tell their friends, right? This is what caused Pivotal Labs to grow the way it did. But really the big secret, the open secret, people don't really talk about this, right? They talk about, oh, Pivotal Labs, everybody pairs, right? They write a lot of tests. Pretty cool. They have breakfast. Really nice environment. These days you read about Pivotal Labs or Pivotal like almost every day. In New York Times, Forbes, there was one today about our CEO talking about a lot of this stuff. But really the big thing is teams, small teams, right? Small teams working together, cross-functional. Some of those buzzwords like cross-functional and balance came later on. We were doing this 10, 12 years ago, right? It was always this belief that the best way to produce software is to assemble a small team, have it work together well, and give it the tools that it needs. So, and software development is very much about collaboration, right? Yes, coding is hard, and architectures and microservices and which tools you use and new frameworks every 2 weeks. But at the end of the day, the hard thing is communicating. People making decisions, communicating those decisions, the vision behind them, right? The information you get from putting a piece of software in front of your users, that's communication because you're learning something there. More decisions, it's just collaboration. So what does cross-functional and collaborative really mean, right? It means that you don't have different departments, you don't have different disciplines sitting on different floors in different areas, right? They're sitting together. There's a product person, somebody that's kind of the product manager, design, testing, everybody working together. We're not pushing work from one place to another. We're not organizing that way. We're organizing for the work to stay in one place and the team gathering around it with their hands on the work and pushing it to a finish line, right? Getting to its goals, whatever the product goals may be. We're not working as a team if we don't have shared goals and shared priorities, right? In contrast, right, you might have a manager, project manager, assigning tasks to individuals and then, coming along every couple of days to ask, how is your task going? When are you going to be done, right? That's not really working together as a team. As a team, we know what our priorities are. We don't have to be managed, right? We are working in a collective ownership fashion. So basically, this small team is the building block, right? We're saying, this is our hypothesis or our thesis here, that the only way you can really grow a product organization is if you start with small, cross-functional, balanced teams with the right roles, working together the right way, right? So let's dive into what this small team consists of, right? And it's pretty simple. You have a product manager. Now, back in the original XP Pivotal Labs days, we never really talked about product managers. We said, hey, there's a customer in the room, right? You just got to have the customer in the room. Well, that's great, except the customer had no idea how to actually be a product manager. Like, there's a very big difference between somebody who's a customer. It means like it's their product, or maybe it's their job to like represent the customer organization. They're business analysts. They're writing requirements, right? That is not what a product manager is, or it's not everything that a product manager is. A PM this is a pretty intense role, right? I know we have some in the room here, and you guys know this is hard, right? You've got to operate on multiple levels. You got to think big. You have to drive consensus. You have to figure out a path, right? You have to find out by doing lots of things, talking to a lot of people, research, data, looking at competition. You are there to take that big idea, the big vision, the big mindset, but break it down and then operate in a very fine-grained level, right? This is where all of the complexity is. It's all in the details. So, here there's a picture of my product, Pivotal Tracker, and really the main difference between Tracker and other tools in this space is that it's much more fine-grained. It sort of forces you to break things down to little tiny stories and then manage hundreds and hundreds and thousands of these stories just flowing and flowing. It's just an endless river of little stories. And there's only one river, right? And your job as a PM is to manage that river and to work with the entire team, with that cross-functional, that balanced team, to get the job done, to get to these milestones. All these stories are just taking us closer and closer to something interesting for the business, for the product, right? Every step we learn. So this role is the facilitator of all that. Now, that last point there, the deciding bit, right? When you hear about balanced teams, there's a lot of emphasis on, decisions are made very collectively, right? We have consensus, we have the same information, therefore we reach the same conclusion. Well, yes, you want that, right? I mean, that's obviously ideal. But at the end of the day, it has to be somebody's job to be able to make some hard decisions, right? In terms of scope, right? Because things always take longer than you want them to. You've got to make some decisions about what you're not going to ship as part of that MVP, right? You also have to decide priorities. Right, so you are the little mini CEO, the coach. There's many parallels to this. This is the most important role there is. I would not build anything except maybe like a little side project without a proper product manager. And these are hard to find, by the way, so it's a tough situation. Working hand in hand with the PM is the product designer, right? And I noticed I didn't call it a UI designer, UX, or visual. Those are all specific skills, right? There's a whole spectrum of what designers do. This is thinking about how the product should work, or how to solve our stated problems, or taking a hypothesis about what could solve a problem. How do we validate assumptions that we're making, right? What experiments can we run? Ultimately, it's about designing interfaces, right? Which may be UI, they may be even APIs, but at the end of the day, right, this is the person thinking about the how. The PM is the what, this is the how. And guess what? They're working close together. There's all kinds of slides and talks on how these days there's this very strong PM and product designer overlap. There is, and it's moving closer together. It actually gets kind of interesting because it turns out that at least in my experience, most product designers over time figure out that they really want to be product managers, right? So it's kind of a thing you have to manage today. But yeah, they're joined at the hip. They're working together almost as a pair. And of course, we have developers. Now, apologies to people in this room, right, who've gone to computer science, school, hardcore engineering. Like, yes, we are engineers, and I used to be one. But these days, I like to think of this role as a developer. We're building products, we're developing. We're not necessarily doing hardcore engineering on a lot of products. It applies. We need to have access to it. But really, from my perspective, the important thing is people that work together well as a team. That's the powerful thing. So I want to optimize for that, right? I don't want to hire developers that are going to put on headphones all day and then get into their zone for, who knows how long, and then they're, almost done for a long time. No. We're working in the fine grain. There's a lot of communication that's got to happen, right? So no headphones. We're going to work together. Of course, Pivotal Labs, every developer pairs, which is just, collaboration and communication taken to 11. And ideally, we have everyone on the team. Everyone on the team is driven by the common good, the common goal, right? As opposed to, I'm just going to care about the part of the code that I have to work on. And you can touch anything, right? And the rhythm, what does this product developer do all day? Obviously, they do a lot of communicating with the rest of the team, the PM, the designer. But the core activity is write a test, make it fail, write the code, test passes, refactor, repeat, and ship, right? We found in our scientific studies that developers are happiest when they're shipping often, right? So that is the most important thing you can do as a team. All right, so as a product team, right, when you think of balanced teams, you always think of them as small teams, right? Small teams is for the win. That's how we want to organize. So what is small, right? Like how many people does it make sense to have on your product team, right? Of course, it depends on the context and what kind of thing you're doing, right? Maybe it depends on how affordable developers are, but really it's about communication, right? And, it's a lot of words, but basically it says that historically, right, according to this author anyway, over hundreds of generations, humans have always gravitated toward working together in groups of 10 to 15, right? He called it the 10 group, whether it's farming or hunting and gathering, whatever. Anything that was sort of a task bigger than that which one person could do independently, right? It was groups of 10 to 15 that would come together, and they would naturally evolve to working in this collective fashion, right? Where there's a common goal, everybody's working together, there's a greater good, right? This is motivating. If you look at disciplines or environments or industries or kind of things, other examples where teams come into play, when you think of like organized sports, team sports, right? Those are strong teams, right? They focus so much on working together, on having a common mission to win the game, to win the championship. In the military, right? You have pretty much every military organization is decomposed into small units, right? That are well equipped, they're trained, they have their missions, right? So software is really no different, right? So what's the right size? Well, I think software development is more complicated than farming, but I really don't know. I've planted a tomato tree. It produced some tomatoes, so I think it's pretty simple, right? Probably isn't. But at the end of the day, we're optimizing for communicating, right? So obviously, if you have a lot of people, like if all of us were one team, we might have a tough time. I think there's probably too many of us, right? If you don't have enough people, like it's kind of, there's something missing. Like if it's just, me and this guy, just hanging out, and we're just working together every day, all day, week in, week out, like that's not sustainable. We would have some issues, right? We'd need to see other people, right? So you need to have enough people to kind of mix it up. Jeff Bezos says, like, if 2 pizzas aren't enough, then you're not really a team anymore, right? So there's many indicators as to when, you're too big. One thing to consider, right, this is a little bit sort of unique to Pivotal or teams that do pair programming, and that is how many perspectives do you have on the team, right? If you have 2 people, just going to keep it simple, 2 people pairing, right? How many perspectives are there? How many unique pair-brain combinations? Because those are the ones that give you the sort of bigger, powerful perspective when you put 2 heads together. So when you have 2 heads, there's one perspective, right? Pretty much only one way to slice it, which is why the 2 of us shouldn't, work on a project alone, because we just start seeing the world the same way, which is not good. So when you add 2 people, you have 4 people. How many perspectives do we have now? Anybody? Don't count the lines. All right, 6. So yes, now you have 6 perspectives. So now we're getting, collectively, we're smarter than the sum of the individual parts, right? Because there actually are 6 different combinations, because when you take any 2 people here together, you will come up with uniquely different ideas and ways of thinking and ways of solving problems, right? So this is getting kind of powerful, right? How many do we have now? Quick.
N-1 factorial.
So it's 15, right? We have 15 perspectives here, and we can keep going. Now, 15 perspectives is starting to get a little bit hard to manage. Like, have we actually paired everyone with everyone already? Like, now we're starting to have a lot of disagreements about how to do things, right? Every new pair decides they're going to take a different path. And it's not just the perspectives, right? Like, above a certain number of people, it's just, you can't really communicate anymore. So at Pivotal, right, I mean, we know our world, and of course, mileage will vary depending on where you go, but we've, over the years, have sort of honed in on the kind of 8-person team, right? 1 product manager, 1 designer, and never more than 1 product manager. That is just a bad idea, right? You need 1. There's 1. 1 captain. So one product manager, a designer, and then I would say 4 to 6 developers, okay? Which is 2 to 3 pairs. That is the sweet spot. That's ideal. A team like that can get so much done. Unfortunately, there's only so much they can get done, and there's always pressure to do more, right? And when you succeed as that one team, maybe now you have VCs pouring money into your coffers, or your company's decided to increase your budget. So what do you do with that budget? Hire more people, right? Ultimately, you will do more with more people. Ideally, you can do more linearly, and that's really what we're here to talk about. How do you scale up, right? And stay agile / just sane, right? Like, it's got to stay sane. So let's talk about moving to multiple teams for one. I don't know, let's take some crazy example. Like, nobody would ever do this, right? But somebody launched this game, and people are going crazy catching these things in the streets. But it's just an iOS game. Like, they have basically 1 product, right? 1 team, they build 1 product. But like, oh my God, the world's going crazy, right? Microsoft's like, please build a Windows phone or whatever. There's obviously an Android version that needs to happen, because exactly half of the United States is up in arms because they can't go catch these things. We want to go beyond the US, right? Like, hello, Europe, Asia, all those countries, South America. And we got to make more money, right? We're doing well, but we're not making money. Our stock is tanking. Why is that? So we've got to monetize, right? How do we monetize? So now we have more people, and now we have to reorganize, right? We can't work as a single team anymore. Like, it's getting crazy. We can't do all this as 1 team, right? You could try, but you will fail. So what do? Now, we get this kind of thing all the time. Our support team for Pivotal Tracker we get tickets like this. We've been using your tool for a while. It's been working pretty well, but now I don't know. It's like we don't know what's wrong. We think we need some features. We need better reporting. Can you have due dates on stories, right? Can you have parallel tracks in one project? It's just a mess. We're having a hard time managing our project. We're thinking of moving to another tool that has a lot more features, right, to help us manage. So sometimes they will go there, then they'll come back and say, can we have a conversation? So I sometimes have these conversations, right? And we quickly hone in on the fact that, great, you have 30 people, you don't have a team, they're just working on a bunch of different things. You're all working on the same project because, your project is your company or your entire product. So how about breaking things down into small teams? And by the way, if you do this collective ownership thing, you don't really have to manage individual developers anymore, right? They self-organize. The next developer to free up on each team, they pick up the next story, they get it done, knowledge is shared, right? We're not managing tasks. So things get a lot easier if you do this. So they go away, they do this, they reorganize into, I don't know, let's say these 4 teams. And naturally, they're organized around the code bases, the apps, the platforms. Those are the discrete architectural components in their world, or at least those are the ones that they're building. And they seem pretty independent, right? Like Android app, iOS app, let's say there's a web front end where you want to maybe convince people that come to your site to sign up, give them a little taste of the game, right? Maybe there's like a leaderboard that you want to do to help create some virality and a network effect. And of course, there is a platform team, right? They're all about scaling, all the sort of hard stuff, databases, web scale, Mongo, whatever. That's the platform team. They will scale. They are the scaling ones. So cool. They go away for a while. Things seem to be working well until they come back with another support ticket. And they're like, hey, we need dependencies, okay? Well, why do we need dependencies? Well, because every story, needs another story to be done, and that story needs another story to be done, and then, we need to just create this massive web of complexity because that is how we want to, manage a project. Well, really, it's because everything that they're now doing, once these apps are in a steady state, right? It's not just about getting to the MVP or 1.0 of the Android app or, the iOS app. Now we're sort of getting into specific features that now span all of those teams, right? Every single feature now goes from the platform to iOS and Android. Everything's a meeting, we're coordinating. Now we have multiple PMs for every single product initiative, every outcome that we're going after, right? So a lot of meetings, a lot of coordination, a lot of documents, and guess what? Dependencies. So is there a better way? Now, maybe this won't work for everyone, right? But perhaps we could reorient. Instead of thinking about our teams this way, the back end down here, and then all the sort of user-facing things up top, what if we were to turn 90 degrees? What happens, though, in situations like this is that your product components are starting to not be cohesive because we have teams that are sort of focusing on their layer in the architecture, and then the further down stack you are, the back-end team or platform team, the more disconnected you feel. So these are some other symptoms that are arising. You're feeling like not recognized, and we've had a lot of this. Every time we roll out a feature, the feature is sort of manifested in terms of whatever people see in the UI, right? There's a new button, right? Now they can paste emoji, whatever, right? It's like, yay, good job. But it's always good job front-end team, good job iOS team. We forget about those poor developers who did all the scaling, built those API endpoints. They're just invisible, right? They're just the back-end people. They feel sad. And we already talked about the PM coordination, right? So tracker support says, let's go vertical, okay? Let's do this vertical thing. Let's just try it, right? So what does vertical mean in this context? Well, it means, before we talk about what it means, we should consider, and I think most of you are probably familiar with this, right? You see this these days in every microservices architecture book, but Melvin Conway said, or his observation was that the systems that organizations produce, software or any kind of systems really, the products as seen from the consumers will manifest the organizational structure of the people that built them, right? So if you split into a front-end, back-end team, your product is going to be 2 pieces, a front-end and a back-end, and they're going to be pretty different. They're going to have to work together, right? So this doesn't tell us how to organize. It just says you need to be conscious of this when you think about how to organize teams, because your product will basically look the same way, right? So how do we want our product to be? Where do we want the seams to be? What do we want to be more cohesive, right? So one way is to organize around specific product goals, right? Instead of forming teams around architecture, right? Back end, front end, left end, middleware, right? iOS, Android. You form, at least in some steady state, you form around specific product initiatives, right? Because the end goal here is to have one PM be able to take a feature from its inception, its idea, its hypothesis, or problem rather, take a problem and see it all the way through to a solution, right? Ship, deliver to the customer, and be empowered to do that with one team rather than bouncing around from one PM and team and everything's just coordination. We want to minimize dependencies rather than, like manage around them or with them. And at the end of the day, we want the best possible product outcome. We want the best product for our customers. So let's organize around product lines. So this mythical game company decided to reorganize into these 4 buckets, right? Or these 4 teams. They're going to have a core gameplay team. This is focused on engagement, right? Getting people playing and keeping them playing, reduce churn. Of course, there's a scaling team because that's a real business problem. You've got to reduce those outages that happen every day at lunch when everybody goes out into the streets to catch these things. We want to go global. Well, that's a product initiative. So let's figure out what we need to do, right? Of course, we've got to internationalize, localize. We've got to do, language mappings and all that stuff. But let's have one team do that rather than coordinating across all the teams to make sure that words show up in different languages, right? And let's say monetization, right? Now we want it so that people are forced to spend money in the game on magical, balls and cookies and candies and things because that's how we're going to make money, right? So great. Now we have our 4 missions. We have 4 teams. They got their 2 pizzas. They can go. Awesome. Everything's perfect now. So thanks for listening. Obviously, it doesn't end there. Let's look at some real examples, right? So Pivotal Tracker, to kind of use ourselves, because this is what, our world, what I know. We've gone through some growth, right? It isn't to thousands of people, but there's a lot of stuff that happens just going from one team of 4 to 6 people, or a handful, a pair, to 30, 40, right? You got to figure some stuff out. So here's sort of what we figured out. Now, before we go further, our app is pretty much a complex, dense, single-page application, right? There's a Rails backend. There's literally one page where you spend most of your time dragging things around and updates are coming in and things are moving around on you. And pretty much the same thing for the mobile apps, iOS and Android. They're pretty dense, lots of things happening, right? And it didn't start out in the recent years, right? We didn't sort of start out as a bunch of little microservices and everything organized around them. That is certainly where it's moving to, right? We're decomposing the monolith. But at the end of the day, it's one product on one page for our customers, more or less. And we organize traditionally the same way, right? There's a front end, there's a back end, and there's mobile. It's not super complicated, but even just this, the front and the rear, just created more and more and more pain, like I described, right? In particular around communication, around sort of collaboration between the back-end PM, the platform PM, and the front-end PM, right? This also led to a couple of things. One is rigid silos. It means that you sort of have the specialization now. You have, in the front-end team, we had 6 developers who pretty much knew nothing but JavaScript, right? And JS frameworks. On the back end, you've got the Rails people. They know databases and DevOps and, Chef and Bosch and all those things. And then you have the mobile, well, really 2 teams, people who know Objective-C, and then you have, Java for Android. And so nobody would touch any other code base. I am a JavaScript developer. That's all I do. So everything that we ended up doing ended up, if in terms of prioritizing at the level of the entire product, which is sort of my job, right? This meant that I could only prioritize within these 3 or 4 buckets, right? I can't say, well, let's go after a problem that is more focused on the back end or just the core web app, because I cannot take advantage of those other developers. So those other developers on the mobile team and platform, well, they need something to do as well while we're focusing on the only thing or the most important thing. So our prioritization is like chopped up, it's constrained, it's siloed. And of course, there's no knowledge transfer, there's different cultures. Like literally people are fighting, like the back-end team and the front-end team, like sort of create these antagonistic kind of, like there's not a culture of working together as one product, right? There's multiple cultures now. This is also how we ended up with a bunch of very long rewrites, because you sort of end up with this very kind of defensive code-centric mentality around each of these buckets, because we just care about our part of the code. Now, that code may end up being awesome, right? But at the end of the day, if it's sort of overshadowed by all the communication issues and like not shipping the right things and being constrained. So a lot of stuff packed in here. So what do? We moved to these pods. They're called pods because my name is Podsedly. Not really. They're pods because they're more these like vertical sort of, you can think of them like little spaceships or something flying in space. You're going fast, you got a mission. They have seats. You can get in, hang out, you can get out, right? So there's really two things here. One is organizing into these little mini teams or sub-teams. And by the way, we also call them pods because we wanted to keep the word team for us as a whole group. Like product, we have one product, pivotal tracker. Yes, we have 30, 40 people, but it'd be nice if we could still call ourselves one team, right? So let's use a different word, pods, more fluid, they move fast, you can get in and out, right? So that's what we went with. And each of these pods now has a little bit more of a cohesive mission, right? There's still an infrastructure pod because there's a lot of stuff that we still have to do with scaling, and we're also moving Tracker to a new home on Cloud Foundry. And so there's a lot of kind of long-running project or work there that team is going to focus on. But they're not only allowed to touch the Rails code or other parts that are behind the API. They can touch anything, right? So they recently worked on synchronization issues from our web client and the back end, and they went vertical. They touched the front end, they touched the back end, right? They made a bunch of cohesive commits. They fixed the problem. It worked really well. Story management is, we had a tough time with naming. That's sort of the core kind of workflow, managing stories, the story to code connection, right? All the sort of usability around that, and some special projects. Onboarding, sort of a new thing, which is grow our signups, increase our conversions, get people to what we call an activated state sooner, right? So teach them, get them in, get them through the funnel, and get them to the aha moment. So that's their mission. That's what that PM is going to be focused on. And then finally, we have kind of an enterprise pod, which is focusing on launching Tracker for larger companies, right? And again, they're touching a lot of things. They recently, or actually they're in the middle of redesigning the dashboard, because we had to redesign the dashboard in order to make this new kind of visibility sharing or setting for projects work, right? Now you can join Tracker and see all the projects that are around you at the company you just joined, but that was difficult with the old dashboard, so they took that on. They did single sign-on, which is a part of the enterprise offering, etc., right? They're not constrained. They can touch anything. So this has been working really well. One thing I have to say, it's kind of obvious, like naming of these things becomes a bit of a challenge, right? Because they're more fluid, their focus, their themes may change over time, right? Today, the growth pod is focusing on the sign-up funnel and conversions, but maybe in 3 to 6 months, they'll actually shift to something a little bit different. So do we rename the pod? I think the ultimate, if you take this all the way, you end up with like colors or numbers, team A, team B, team C, animal names, right? Which is fine because you're optimizing for efficiency, for getting things done, for working as teams. The problem is, well, there's a few problems that happen. I'll talk about some of them, but naming is a challenge here. Now, these arrows are supposed to indicate like there's more movement of people between these things. So yes, very much. But this now becomes the interesting challenge, right? When you have teams organized around code bases, around discrete sort of components and services, it's pretty obvious that people will pretty much stay with those teams. All the JavaScript developers will stay with the JavaScript, right? And so on. If you're moving to more sort of product-oriented initiatives, you now have different needs at different times. So the PM working on enterprise over the last few weeks needed people who could implement single sign-on on the iOS app, right? Well, that's about rotations. That's about letting our engineering director know that need is coming up. I mean, that's sort of a very collectively known thing. And making sure that there is at least one iOS, somebody because I don't want to use the words like iOS developer. That's not a label, right? It's just somebody who happens to have some grounding, some understanding of that code base and how you deploy that app, how you launch it to the store, that would be as part of that pod, pairing with other people who may not have as much understanding of that area, so that they can get the job done and so that that knowledge spreads. So you have spreading knowledge and you have focus, but it does require an investment in rotations or the ability to rotate people, right? So you want the PMs to stay stable. They just think about their product problems, right? And they have a pod or team of people, a small team that they can execute on those missions with, right? Developers are the ones that are moving around more. Now, it doesn't mean like every day we pick up and move to different chairs. This is still pretty managed, right? And it's not super aggressive, but it means like every week there is an email that goes out that says, hey, allocations for this week, and there is some rotation. And there's a lot of emphasis on maintaining a balance of continuity, right? And context, but providing the right skill set at the right time and fostering knowledge sharing, right? So this becomes a pretty big balancing act. Now, the nice thing is that if you're pairing, right, if you're pair programming, it's a lot easier because pairing is a super fast way to pick up context, to ramp up. You join a team, you're not there by yourself trying to read all their wiki pages and figure out like how this stuff works and like, I'm just gonna browse the code for a week. No, have your breakfast, now come, let's pair, right? And they're digging in, they're working on the problem right away, even though they may have no context in that part of the code base or that part of the product, but they pick it up super fast because pairing. And finally, this is probably the most controversial thing, right? We can't have a different way of working in each team/pod, right? If we're going to be able to move people around, you've got to have some consistency. Now, we struggled with this, right? The front end team wanted to be autonomous, and they kept like changing how they work. Like, now we're gonna start doing pull requests now because it works well with Circle, CI, or whatever. Okay, well, it's working well for you. Sounds good, right? There's no need to have any other conversation around it, right? But we got to a point where like every team is using different CI tools, right? They're deploying their code differently, right? There's a different rhythm around it. They do story acceptance in some different manner, right? It's like, we have a couple of testers, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, but in terms of their contribution to these teams, it had to change when going from one team to another. So like everything started to diverge, and it's really hard to imagine people flowing, smoothly between the teams unless you make the conscious choice together that you're going to invest in the greater good, right? And yes, we would prefer to keep using Circle CI, but you know what? Concourse has turned out really well on this other team, and there's some familiarity. We've sort of documented how to use it. Let's just go with Concourse across the board, right? And similarly, even just tools like the IDEs that you use, right? How you organize your code base. It doesn't mean there can only be one way of doing something, but let's at least make all of those ways shared. Pivotal's always had this like shared workstation images, right? Basically, every workstation you go to, every Mac, is exactly the same. It's the same password, right? It doesn't belong to anybody. It's got the same tools installed, and it keeps evolving. It means that like any pair can sit down on any machine or with any other person on any team, and like there's familiarity, and they can just hit the ground running, right? And it's focused on the business problem now, not relearning tools and process. But I would say that's probably the hardest transition for our team. All right, so the other thing, we're in a conference that's where everybody's talking about microservices and little tiny things, working well together. And here I am talking about monoliths, right? So bad Dan. But, we did start with a very sort of integrated, it's really one app that's grown. We've decided that multiple Git repos are a pain in the ass when going, slicing vertically, because everything now needs to span multiple repos. You have different commits going to different repos. It's hard to follow things. And so we've embraced we're moving to a mono repo, and Google has been doing this for a long time, right? Google doesn't have one product, they have, hundreds or thousands, and they've made it work. So we're trying to make it work where it's one repo, but organized pretty aggressively. Things are separate. We have different services. Things are deployed independently, but there's one repo. So you can do one pull request, for example, that touches everything, and you know exactly what changed. Again, the question of how it's deployed is independent of this. We also very much rely on on-demand environments. So if we're working on a feature, maybe even just one story, with one API call, you can create an environment on your path. So we use PWS, Pivotal Web Services, a lot for this. And now you have an isolated environment on demand. It's brought up, and you can focus on all the sort of testing and everything that has to happen, in an isolated manner. And all this kind of works well together, right? We have one UI or CI pipeline that builds everything, all the dependencies, right? So we always know when one component might be breaking another component, right? So all of this becomes this sort of collectively owned thing, right? This is our code. This is how we organize. This is how we deploy. But we're going to be working independently in teams focusing on the business problems, right? One thing that does come up as well, who worries about the state of the code, refactorings, for example, code quality? Who does that, right? When you just have people floating around. These are not mutually exclusive, right? You still have engineers that care about this code base, right? But we want to turn around a little bit. Instead of code first, then product, we want it to be product first, then code, right? Again, I might, get assaulted for this one day, but I do believe that product initiatives should drive things like major refactorings and investments in new frameworks, right? Rather than the other way around in anticipation of product needs coming along, right? So this changes the mentality a little bit, and I think it's healthy. Now, we may hit a wall with this, we're not sure, right? But this is the direction that we've taken. So obviously, just kind of switching topics a little bit, obviously once you've gone to multiple teams, you have multiple PMs, right? So how do multiple PMs work together? Well, they better agree on some things, right? There's no sort of silver bullet here. Obviously, you need to have one person that sort of owns the product as a whole, right? So you're getting a little hierarchical. So I'm the GM for the product, and I manage 3 or 4 PMs, each focused on those pods. There is one visible roadmap. Like, it's a simple thing. You just have to have one that everybody can see, and this is what keeps us going in the same direction. And you just have to have a lot of communication. I mean, at the end of the day, you need structure for this. Communication doesn't just happen. It doesn't just flow naturally, especially when you have 30, 40 people. Maybe you're distributed. There has to be process that makes information flow and synchronization, right? So our little product team, there's a all hands or all teams stand up, then there are team or pod specific stand-ups, and then later in the day there is a product stand-up that the PMs and the designers go to. So every day there's a sync point. There's a weekly roadmap kind of synchronization meeting where all the PMs go to. That's where we discuss some of the hard things and make trade-off decisions. And we do our own, or there's these parallel rhythm of retrospectives, because we want to evolve the product communication process. And those retros are focused on the product process, right? How we communicate, how to make it better. Design also gets more interesting when you have multiple designers, right? Because it's such a broad skill, and every designer has maybe different sort of biases. Some are much more user research oriented. Some are a little bit more like intuitive, right? Or they're more focused on the visual, on how it looks, how it behaves. And so the good thing is that when you have multiple, it creates this like super awesome, it's a balance of all these biases, and you get this really amazing kind of design perspective and execution. But again, you need process around how multiple designers are going to work together, right? And so some questions come up are, what sort of feeds the design, the sort of bigger picture design, right? Designers are working with PMs, right? Like the whole spectrum, making assumptions, validating those assumptions, experiments, right, wireframing, user journeys, et cetera, et cetera. And so mostly that's a designer working with a PM, but we also have a sort of a collective, like, here's our roadmap driving the bigger picture design. We want to stay connected. We're not designing 3 or 4 different products. It's one product, right? So the design team has to work together. And so we want to balance rotation of designers between the PMs, and PMs and designers do tend to get into long-term relationships, right? Because design work, it's less discrete. It isn't just, okay, I started the design for this problem, and now I'm finished and moving on to the next thing. Like, things tend to kind of go up, they taper off, new things start, right? There's a lot of phases. And so inherently it means that designers are going to get married to product managers, and you have to break them up, right? And it's hard. They get sad. They miss one another, but it's okay. They can still be friends, and maybe they get to see each other again down the road, right? This is like a hard thing, and this is kind of becoming, one of my biggest jobs, is keeping things moving, avoiding silos and this kind of ossification effect that you get when you have, a product designer and a designer, or PM and a PD or designer working together too long, right? So this is something that has to be managed. And finally, one other thing comes up. another thing that comes up with this more fluid organization of teams / pods is this question of, well, if you find a bug, I mean, obviously, if a particular pod, finds a bug because a test fails or they just discover something when they're playing around, like, well, they should just kind of fix it, right? Or at least they get to prioritize it first. If it's something that's found, by a customer, it's reported to our support team, well, then who fixes it, right? Because you no longer have this strong kind of affinity between code, product areas, and teams, because people, the enterprise team might be touching dashboard and SSO and, data retention, storing more data. It's a lot of things. We just found some bug that has on the sign-in page. Is it related to SSO? I don't know. So who fixes it? Well, there's no answer to this, right? The answer is, it depends. Make your best guess, put it in that icebox, which is the sort of inbox or the triage point in our projects in Tracker. And then the PMs have to communicate. That PM looks at that and says, I think this is, this other PM, because they were just working in that area, so I'm just going to drag that over there, right? I can do that. Or I'll just walk over and have a conversation, right? So this is one of those, like, you just have a conversation about it, figure it out. And in practice, it isn't actually a problem. It seemed like it was going to be a problem, 6 months ago when we moved to this model, but it really hasn't, because once in a while we have a conversation, that's about it. A new role emerges now at this level scale, right? You now have this maybe testing concern, right? Like, unit testing and test-driven development are great. It doesn't mean that everything works together perfectly, right? You need some human judgment to come in and think about combinations that maybe you didn't anticipate when you're focused on your tests and your test suites. So these are important roles. What's the right ratio? I'm not sure. It's certainly not like one team needs, every single team or every single little team needs or balanced team needs a tester. I think it's a smaller number. We have 2. I'm not sure how many Cloud Foundry has. I believe they only have like 1 or 2. And they're pairing with developers. They're sort of like focusing that all the test suites cover the right cases, right? They do some manual testing, etc. And finally, there's this question of who helps with support, right? If support picks up a customer problem and it's something where like somebody can't load their project and like they can't figure it out. They can go pretty deep, but they can't figure it out. So which team helps with support? Well, we want to be fair. This is a shared problem. So we have this bunny, right? Every morning at stand-up, one of the things that we discuss as part of our process is who is support pair today, right? And it's a rotating thing. Well, we haven't done it in a while, people usually just volunteer, like, yeah, we'll do it. All right, they take Pierre, the support Pierre has Mr. Pierre, right? He sits on their desk, and it's very visible who the support team needs to walk over to ask for help. And they're very willing because they're taking that responsibility that day. Finally, you're building a team here as you grow. It's important to stay connected. If people don't feel connected to one another, they're reluctant to communicate. They're less willing to help one another, right? There's less trust. So you got to just do stuff, right? I put a lot of expenses on my Concur American Express for happy hours and all kinds of things like this, right? And it's all just to keep people connected. If we could have a chart on a wall that measures just sentiment on the team, right? And like, it goes up, meaning that sentiment is worsening, or I guess it goes down. People are feeling less happy. There's stuff that's like brewing. Yes, we'll have a retro. It'll alleviate some of it. But then it just keeps going downhill again, right? And then look, we have a picnic. We had a picnic. We spent the day at the park. We drank low alcohol beer. We played games. Okay, we got sunburnt. You come in the next day, suddenly that chart is like through the roof, right? People are just feeling happy. They like suddenly want to work with each other again. And so this is an important part of your culture if you're going to grow your group of people working together. All right, so that was, going from the ideal balanced team to, one real world situation where, we made some choices about how we organize so that we can be multiple teams getting stuff done. So what happens when you go to 50 teams, right? Like, what happens when it gets really crazy, right? So let's look at, hopefully familiar example, and that's Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which is a platform as a service. It has a lot of pieces, right? It started as an open source project at VMware, right? It was fairly large number of people, but kind of working as one sort of group, right? One maybe 30-ish person team. Then it became part of Pivotal, right? And our method is always let's just do things our way now, right? Small teams, pairing, all that stuff. And so it started to grow and it started to decompose into smaller teams. And now they have a pretty huge product, right? It ships, it's sort of a shrink wrap software kind of delivery, right? It's not a software as a service, so they have to basically package it up, make it available for distribution, for downloads, and companies run this on-prem on different infrastructures for that layer of isolation. So they ship, and they grow, and they're getting bigger and bigger, right? They started as something like this in 2012. There were essentially 3 services and 3 teams, or maybe teams. And then they added some more, and they got more people. And then they added a bunch more stuff, and so on, right? So today, it's like, tens, I don't even know how many services, maybe 20, 30, and growing. And they have a lot of teams building these services out. So obviously, at this level of scaling, if you've sort of organized into a lot of components, a lot of these microservices, right? So they very much embrace, and it's always been a sort of microservice approach to the product. But now there's a lot of them, right? And they have dependencies. And some of these teams grew, right? Because they kind of had a bunch of things that were pretty related. Obviously, with this many teams and this many components, you're going to have communication issues, right? That's just a given. So, here's an example of how one of these larger runtime teams decided to chop themselves up because they had, I think, something like 15 pairs at one point working on this, right? That's 30 people. Anybody want to tell me how many perspectives that is? It's a lot, right? I mean, it's just unmanageable. So they broke it down to cohesive or related services, right? So routing, right? As a routing team, they have a couple services, right? 2 sort of different points in the stack, and so on. So, now we're talking about a lot of services, right? A lot of small sort of decoupled things, but they have to work together. Now, if you kind of go back to Conway's law, right? Organizing or like how you organize your people, your organization, like that structure will sort of reflect itself in your product. So it turns out that for a product like a platform, right? Essentially, the product is a collection of fairly loosely coupled services, right? So each of those services has their sort of service-specific product goals, right? So it's actually more natural for them to be organized in terms of these discrete components, the teams aligned to these discrete parts of the architecture of the services. So that's great. And of course, they have to have APIs. This is sort of a given, right? Each of these services has a strong API. It's a version because things have to work together, right? I mean, I could go on here, but this is more now talking about how to organize microservices. And I think there's a lot of information at this conference about that. So really, the biggest challenge now becomes product alignment, right? I mean, they have all kinds of different priorities, right? Like running the platform on a new infrastructure, right? Moving from Amazon to Google, OpenStack, security initiatives, right? User management. And sometimes these things do have to span services, and all of these things have to kind of align. They all have to get to a certain point where they work together, not so much like, it's working, it passed all the builds, but no, it's cohesive as a product, right? We're at where we want it to be. We've met our customer, expectations for this release, right? So this is hard with 30 components and 30 plus teams. So, what does it mean? Yes, you have 30 teams and you have 30 product managers. And I think like Pivotal is sort of unique in that PM to developer ratio, right? If you go to a lot of other companies, they have few PMs, lots of developers. They have architects, right? And you sort of have like the product management group or team communicating with a bunch of architects. The architects all kind of fan out the work to a bunch of engineers. Maybe there's like a matrix organization. It has to be simpler than that because communication is hard, and so you have to make the structure simple. So every service, there's one team, one PM, right? Each team has one backlog. Got to keep it simple. Those are the building blocks. That's not negotiable, right? Now it becomes so what about dependencies? Well, the only real answer is that the PMs, their job, and one of the reasons that they have a healthy ratio, one PM to a small number of developers, is so that they have time, they have bandwidth, and they can think about dependencies, and they can go have conversations and monitor, right, what they are expecting from other teams and vice versa, right? This becomes part of their everyday job, right? And again, you need a whole new level of communication structure, so a little hard to see, but it sort of evolved into a little bit of a hierarchy where you have one kind of Uber PM, right? So it's a VP of product. Then, because there's a lot of services, and sometimes there are sort of things where multiple services have to work together, right, from a product perspective, right? So the path that Cloud Foundry is going down, that they're introducing a new level of product management called product leads, right? The product leads sort of manage, or they oversee and they coordinate a handful of PMs and their teams so that they are cohesive and they align and they're working on something that makes sense in terms of how these things fit together, right? So it's pretty simple, right? But you've got to organize from the bottom up, and you've got to have the small teams and then cluster them, right? And maybe within each of these clusters, it makes a lot more sense to do more rotation between the teams, right? And to go more vertical, like our product Pivotal Tracker has, like, because we could essentially fit into one of these larger boxes, right? Like in the middle ones. But you don't want to have that grow infinitely, right? At some point, you need to cluster and you need to have a layer of product management above it. Another thing that becomes really interesting is when you have 300 developers, like, how do allocations work? Allocations are basically which developers work on what teams on a given week, right? So you have to invest in this. We have a tool. This tool actually came from Pivotal Labs. This is how Labs managed rotations between customer projects, right? And so everybody's now using this. Cloud Foundry has their own sort of instance of this. It's kind of an ugly red because this tool was originally built to indicate, it was optimized for billable projects, right? So customer billable. All of the Cloud Foundry, all the product projects are not billable, so therefore they're red. But the point is that there is a tool, and there are people that do this. Like every week, there's a group of engineering directors that get together, and they figure this out. They figure out who has what needs, who's been on a project for too long or a team too long. Let's rotate. But like, you can't do that just on paper or manually with 300 developers. You need to invest in this as a tool. And actually, I wish there were better tools for this. So if anybody is looking for an idea to go build as a startup, right? Rotation management or resource management, as it would be normally called, but like simple, drag and drop, make it easy, right? We'd buy it. So finally, Cloud Foundry, again, lots of components have to work together, right? So like absolutely there needs to be emphasis on automation, right? At every level. Test suites, to make sure everything works, right? CI pipelines. This is concourse, building a bunch of dependencies, moving artifacts downstream and building the whole thing, right? This has to be green all the time or be kept green. And then again, there's a benefit to having a PaaS in place, right, for on-demand acceptance environments. Finally, right, there's a lot going on, a lot of teams working together. How do you like oversee that, right? How do you manage 30 plus teams and their projects? Like, what's the big picture view, right? This is a tool that was written by Onsi, who hopefully you saw speak this morning, right? This is like a little tool he built on the side. It's called Carrelage, right? What does it do? It pretty much shows, it's a misnomer here. It's not really the forest. These are the trees. He's showing all of the individual stories and what state they're in across all the projects on one page. Like, it's crazy. People look at this and go, I don't know. So many colors, right? And so what he's looking for is the wrong colors, right? One example is what we call pumpkins, right? So pumpkins are orange. In Tracker, stories that are waiting to be delivered to an acceptance environment, they have an orange button on them. So when you see a lot of orange, that's a bad sign. That means delivery is stuck. And so this calls it out. I don't know exactly what to point at, but you would see a lot of orange, and when you see a lot of orange, that's a sign that there's a pumpkin building up, and somebody needs to go have a conversation with that team to see if their builds are stuck, if they've gone on vacation, right? Same thing for Christmas trees, right? So red-green, right? A story that's waiting for acceptance has two buttons on it, a red or a green accept button and a red reject button. So when you see a lot of red and green Christmas tree, it means that the PM is not accepting stories fast enough. They've gone on vacation, they're stuck. This is what they should be prioritizing because that's the communication flow and you want to have that fast. He's also got some aggregate kind of metrics here for efficiency, right? But it's kind of an amazing thing, and you need something like this when you have 300, 400 people working together. So I talked for an hour, but it's really pretty simple, right? We want to grow our teams. It's really just like 4 things you have to do, right? Actually, they're not so easy, but they seem easy now. Build these small, balanced, sustainable teams, right, that work well together, right? Invest in that. We want to organize these teams into cohesive product lines, right? So that we don't have a lot of crazy coordination and communication dependencies. you want to make sure there are tools and processes that embrace and encourage working together, shared visibility, collaboration, simple tools, and that sort of becomes part of the culture. And at the end of the day, we're not going to get it right? We have to be in a sort of a refactoring mindset with the organization, not just our code. We're like, whatever's not working, let's fix it. Let's not be afraid to slice up our organization in a different way and see if that works, right? And then you're good. You just evolve, and the world's a good place. All right, that was it. Hopefully, not too long. Any questions? At the back.
How do you tackle multiple project teams if they are actually different teams?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
How will you tackle multiple product teams who are regionally aligned? They are in Hong Kong, Singapore, Toronto.
Right, so how do you align product teams that are regionally distributed, right? Is that the question? Okay. So Pivotal, we've always been a little bit biased toward not having distributed teams, and that was a easy thing to say until things got bigger. And look at us now. Now even Pivotal's like throughout the world, and there are product teams that span the world. I think the emphasis has to be on communication structure because it's going to be even harder, right? And again, there are tools and structure that has to come in place. We have somewhat of a distributed team, and we make sure that every regular meeting, every single meeting we use a tool called Zoom for kind of video conferencing. Every meeting has to have a Zoom ID, right? Or we're not having that meeting. It has to be open. It has to be easy to join from wherever you are. Ideally, if we could just have it all, we'd all be in the same room so we can walk over and say, hey, what's up? But we don't now. And so we have to have extra communication, including tools, right? I mean, I don't know if there's a better answer to that, but everything has to be, you have to embrace the distributed nature of it. It can't be like by exception or like, wait, most of our team is here, and then we have a few people over here and we're going to forget about them, right? Because they're going to feel like they're not being heard, they're not participating, they're not going to be happy, right? And maybe they're really important people to keep happy, right? So they have to be on the same level in terms of accessibility, visibility. Our stand-ups, I mean, it's kind of people like always point and stare when they see some of the people that we have in the San Francisco office on one of our stand-ups. Our stand-ups, sometimes, depending on where things are, there's like 12 or 14 different faces on one screen, right? But it's become just a natural thing, right? It's like, it doesn't really matter where you are anymore because we've got the rhythms, we've got the stand-ups, we've got the weekly, the planning meetings, the retros, the product demos, like every single thing, every single communication point is open to you wherever you are.
So the continuation on that, is that any pairs training or pairs programming? I mean, in remote programmers?
Absolutely, yeah. So the question is, have we done remote pairing? It happens a lot, actually. We have a few developers that are remote, and again, it just kind of becomes part of the routine, right? Stand up. There are some faces out there, right? If it happens that I'm going to pair with that person, great. The next, as the stand-up is ending, we just say, all right, see you on, and I don't even know what they're using today for the video conferencing. I don't think it's Zoom, it's probably Skype with, screen sharing, right? But everything is set up. It's part of that common tool set, right? It doesn't matter where you are. You can jump on, and then the tools make it pretty easy. So we do it a lot, actually.
The screen sharing, do you standardize on like TeamViewer, or I'm curious what tools you
I think there's actually multiple, and there's a pair preference, right? So the beginning of every pairing day on a remote situation is like, all right, what do you want to use today, right? And both of those tools are actually available as part of the standard image, so we don't have to like hunt for it.
Take just a couple minutes, and if it's not something that you've thought a lot about, I understand, but the concept of domain expertise, you often, not often, but you hit problems that require serious thought, and when you're rotating people off and on, and they're not really getting deep into technology, you get stuck where you write flawed code that has to be refactored multiple times.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we deal with the need for domain expertise and depth, and that could be in terms of the product area, or it could be in terms of the code base, right, and specific technologies. So yeah, I mean that's the obvious flip side of choosing to align and make sort of product themes or goals be the kind of driver for how we organize. But then it's sort of offset by that strong kind of emphasis on engineering allocation management, right? So if we're getting into the weeds somewhere, right? Like for example, our enterprise pod will most likely tackle blockers on stories, right? And that's a core feature, right? You would think that would be something that the story management team would do because they're more in that part of the app and the code base. But actually, from a sort of product perspective, like where we hear most about or the demand for blockers comes from larger teams and larger companies in the enterprise, right? So we want to optimize for that. It means that we're going to have to make sure that there's at least one or two people that have that depth. They will be on that pod for some time, at least at the beginning of it, right? To make sure they can pave the way, right? So, but this becomes this ongoing challenge. It's like, where do we need to have these specializations? And we obviously can't have all the pods working in the same part of the code base that requires that amount of depth because we just don't have enough people, right? So it's not like the engineering specialties become invisible, right? They just become sort of parallel to the product teams. And if I go back to this guy, I mean, you can't see this, but there's a lot of little icons and stuff on this, right? And this is an attempt at Pivotal Labs to sort of indicate specialties and specializations and skills on people, right? So you have a badge that has a little JS on it, right? And there's all kinds of these, right? Like people that know security well, etc., right? So when doing allocations, they're conscious of these things, and they have to have a conversation with the PMs, but where are you going? What are you going to dive into? And based on that, you kind of move people around. But by no means is that that's the final answer and that's it. It's perfect. Like it's a hard problem, and it's a matter of finding the right balance, at least for us.
I will just go back to this multiple regions teams.
Yeah.
For example, we have a team in Tokyo and we have a team in UK, and the time of intersection is like 1 hour. So how can we manage this improvement?
So, I mean, for me, fortunately, I have yet to be in a situation where I have to manage a team that spans time zones where there is less overlap or no overlap. I think there you have to consider the regional or the distribution in terms of how those teams get organized, right? So to have one team of 6, 8, 10 people where half the team are in San Francisco and the other half are in Singapore, like that, you can't really work as a team, right? Unless one half of the team is going to work really strange hours. We've been in many situations where there's a big overlap where it's just shifted by a time zone or two, which is typical in the US. And then somebody has to make a commitment to do their stand-up an hour earlier or an hour later, right? Otherwise, it just doesn't work. If you can't align around the communication points, then I don't think you're really working as a team. So I think it starts with that. And it has to take time zones into account. In the back?
Back to the allocation thing.
Yeah.
At 300 developers, are you assuming that the velocity of each developer is the same?
So that's sorry, the question is, at 300 developers, or is there an assumption being made about, every developer having the same velocity, or the ideal being every developer having the same velocity, right? Is that the question, basically?
Yeah, or does that account for the difference?
So the thing with velocity, right, and that's probably a whole talk in itself, right? It's not something that we think about on a per developer. I mean, there's a but coming. We don't think about, velocity or points on a per developer basis, right? It's like, it's a team thing. It's a trend, right? And it maybe gives you a little bit of like kind of cartoon prediction of when you might be close to your milestone, but it's nothing more than that, right? And like we estimate because it forces the conversation, right? And we stick to that. Like, yeah, we're going to estimate, we even estimate like design work, not so much like, who's going to get the credit or how much and how long is it going to take, but more like if we're not forced to think about things in terms of 1, 2, 3, or small, medium, large, like we're not asking the right questions. So back to, the sort of team velocity when you have 30 teams, right? Well, obviously, if people are working pretty independently and they're kind of siloing, then the point currency starts to diverge, right? So one team, delivering 6 or getting 6 points accepted every week, and then you have another team and they're getting 12 points delivered, like, is is the second team doing twice as much work? Are they twice as fast? No, they've just maybe honed in on a different granularity of estimation. So you can't really take these velocities and add them up. It's meaningless, okay? It's really just a team level indication of whether you're slowing down, speeding up, and maybe a little bit like clearly if there's 50 points of stories that you've estimated in the backlog and you're doing 5 points a week and you're being consistent, right? Then maybe that's a little bit predictive, right? But it's more just a kind of a very sort of fuzzy kind of measure, and it's team level. However, at this level, right, and this is the but. So but, one of these charts here shows something like the total number of points accepted over time divided by number of developers. So guess what? That's the per developer velocity. Like, oh my God, are we, what's going on? Like, are we, contradicting ourselves here? And again, it's meant to be, like, it's an interesting ratio, right? But all it is about, all that matters is how it's trending, right? And the emphasis is on whether we are maintaining, roughly speaking, whether we're maintaining the same level of productivity as we grow, right? And when that stops growing, when that chart stops going up, that means we should not hire any more people, right? Now, does it really, and have we really broken it down to like how many developer, or how many points for this developer, that developer? Like, it doesn't matter. It's just like a, it's a weather indicator, and it forces some conversation. So fortunately, that indicator's been, actually, even if it doesn't go up, as long as it stays steady, and I think it's, actually, I'm not sure which one of these it is, but there is one there that's obviously not very labeled. But yeah, that's how we think about it, and that's how, Ansi, the guy who runs all this, that's what he focuses on in terms of velocity and people. Any other thoughts, questions? I think it's probably beer time, past due beer. All right, well, thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.